Hi.
Good morning, Nava.
Good afternoon,
You know,
guys.
this is being recorded, so the whole HR
Yes,
gets
everyone
it.
could see
Okay. Can we Nava,
our
how's
family
school?
reunion. Guys, I don't have class until 8 p.m.
Okay, great. Well, you're about to learn a lot of Gemara.
I know that's why I'm able to do this every week, I realized.
Nava, what'd you do for Shabbos? Even though
I was
we're
in a frat.
on a recorded line here.
Recording.
Okay. Who'd you go to?
The Hirsches. They moved from Colorado.
That's exciting. Did you meet any of mommy's friends?
We did not leave the house.
Okay, hold on one second. I'm gonna just pause my video for a second. We got Rosa and Evie here. It's the Oberstein Daf Yomi.
Are they still jet lagged?
It's never jet lag, and didn't go to Israel.
But what's the daf? I want to open it.
Kiddushin Chaf Aleph 21.
No. Okay. Is this really just an Oberstein party?
No. I'm going to start because I have a whole introduction to give, but I feel bad doing it before other people join.
Am I not the only one that matters?
Give me 1 second. No.
So
Marry me, Archie.
Hi, Evie.
Alf, I really miss you. I want to catch up. When are you available?
Today I'm available.
Like all day?
Ooh.
Okay, good.
I mean, guys, it's like 3 o'clock.
Okay, let's do Daf Yomi. Okay, so here's the introduction now because you missed Daf yesterday. So, and the day before. So the Gemara has shifted from talking about marrying a woman to buying a slave. And part of the reason for that is that there are many similarities, shockingly, between these two methods of acquiring someone, because they both involved ownership, but it's not complete ownership because there's ways out of the ownership. It's not permanent. And very interestingly, of course, if the Torah explicitly talks about when someone buys a non-Jewish, a Jewish woman as a slave, a minor as a slave, there's the potential to marry her. That's called yi'ud, right? Yi'ud is where you can convert the being a slave into being a wife. Of course, the roles change, not to confuse anyone. So we talked about that, but one of the details of slavery, which is not a case of marriage, is that you can buy yourself out of it, right? You can do pidyon. And so, yeah, again, that's an interesting distinction. But you can do pidyon. The Torah very clearly talks about it. The Torah has many different nuances about it. And we've talked about a lot of these details, but yesterday we expanded this, started talking about other cases where you do pidyon, including a couple I'm going to highlight here. The first is what's called a stei achuza, right? If you inherit a field from the division of Eretz Yisrael, and goes through your family inheritance, and you inherit it son after son, you could then sell that field to anybody, but in Yovel, it goes back to you. But if you sell that field and you decide you want to get it back from the person you sold it to, you have a right to redeem it. The Torah very clearly says that. But you can only do it after that person's owned it for 2 years, so starting in the 3rd year after you sold it. And you have to pay prorated based on what number of years remain until Yovel. That's called a stei achuza. There's a separate concept we talked about yesterday of a batei arei choma. If you buy a house from someone in a walled city, it's essentially what we would call an apartment nowadays, meaning you're buying a place to live, but there's no land associated with it. There's no agricultural value. And there, it's the opposite. Those are not, if you buy it, the owner who sold it to you, the original owner can redeem it from you within 1 year of selling it to you. So this person was hard up on their money. They had to sell their house. If they get their money back, they can buy it back from within a year. Basically, you lived in it rent-free. So you had to pay the moving costs, I'm guessing. And after a year has passed, if they don't redeem it, they can never redeem it forever. It stays with you forever, and there's no yovel about batei arei choma. Today, we're going to introduce a third category, which the Torah also talks about, which is somewhere in between, what we call the suburbs nowadays, right? Meaning you have, it's called batei chatzerim. You have a house and you have a yard, right? So it's not a field, it's not a house, it's a combination. It's a house with some space, which Rashi doesn't really mean necessarily you have a yard, but it means that you're outside of a walled city. And so you have an in-between status, and there, we're going to discuss this more today, there, in fact, you're allowed to redeem it up till Yovel as well. The rules of a Batei Chatzerim is very similar to a Stei Achuza, okay? Yesterday, we introduced a fourth concept, or at least we're going to many more than four here, of where you take your field, that's your Stei Achuza. Again, the word Stei Achuza means a field that you inherited, that's your ancestral ownership, and you gave it to Hektish. Because if you give the field to Hektish, then you're allowed to redeem it from Hektish. There's no limitation on not redeeming it in the first 2 years. You have to pay an extra chomesh, an extra quarter, which is what a chomesh ends up being in the Gemara, when you redeem it from Hektish. But if Yovel comes and you don't redeem it, instead of it going back to you, it actually is lost to you forever, forever. It goes to the Kohanim get it, and then it belongs no longer in the category of Stei Achuza. It becomes a Stei Mecher, basically a field that it can be sold. So yesterday, today's daf is daf Chaf Aleph. This is on introduction. And we're trying to make it a little briefer because it's a long daf. Yesterday, we had a big debate between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Shimon about whether or not you can, when you redeem a field, the Torah has a very specific halacha that you cannot, by a Stei Achuza, you cannot borrow money and redeem that field. You either you sold your field for $10,000. If you come up with $10,000, you can go redeem your field, but you cannot borrow from the bank or from your friends for $10,000. It has to be your own money. It's a very unique halacha. And so we debated whether that halacha would also apply to where you gave the field to Hektish. And the Gemara yesterday learned from a pasuk. It says im ga'al yigal. It doubles the language that if you buy it back from Hektish, you can borrow the money. You can redeem it even if you need to. And we said that we needed a pasuk to tell us that, because if we didn't have a pasuk, we would have learned it out from a Stei Achuza that you cannot borrow the money. Okay. Now today's Gemara, we are on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, 4 lines from the top. Amar le Ravacha Breid de Rava the Ravashi. Why in the world would I have concluded that when you are makdish a field, when you give a field to Hektish, it's the same as when you sell a field, unless the Torah came and told me otherwise? Ikan lemifrach. I can ask a question that shows you the difference between those two cases. Because mala mocher bait batei arei choma. Sorry, this is the third case where you sold a house in a batei arei choma. The Chachamim held that you also cannot borrow money to redeem that house, right? And so I would have thought that you can't borrow money to redeem a field from Hektish, Kamashma, and therefore the Torah came and told you that you can. Ask Rav Acha Breid de Rava Ravashi, why would I have compared this to a house? You could have asked a question. It's different. Why would I compare this to buying a house in a Batei Arei Choma? There, Hurak Kocho, there your strength is weakened. Why are you weakened? You can't redeem it forever. You can only redeem it for 1 year. If you are makdish a field, you can redeem it forever, and forever here means till Yovel, but forever until Yovel. Tomar b'makdish yafeh kocho l'ga'el olam. So why in the world would I have compared Hektish to a case of Batei Arei Choma? Why would I have thought, oh, Batei Arei Choma you can't redeem, so Hektish you can't redeem? Hektish is clearly more powerful than Batei Arei Choma, which you cannot redeem forever. Hektish you can redeem forever. Amar Ravacha Saba the Ravashi. So Ravashi didn't answer Ravacha Breid Rava, sorry. But Ravacha, who was the son, Ravacha Saba, sorry, I guess was Ravacha's grandfather maybe, said to Ravashi, well, that's no question that this kid asked. Mishum de'ikla meimar nahader dina teiti b'mahadsat. You could go back and say, yeah, sure. If you sell a house in a Batei Arei Choma, it's a week to sale because it doesn't go, it's a week pidyon, because you can only do it for 1 year. But what about the third case of selling a field in Batei Arei Choma? There you can redeem it forever, meaning till Yovel. And you also can't borrow money to redeem it. So use a mahatzat and say, this is what mahatzat means. What's comparable about both of them? Mocher Stei Achuza yochiach. A mocher Stei Achuza deals with that question. It's a very powerful geula. You can do it forever, meaning until Yovel. But you cannot borrow money to redeem it. You cannot redeem part of the field. So therefore, you can't say that that's unique about a Batei Arei Choma. So we said back to him, well, what are you going to say? There's something that's unique about selling a field. You're weakened in redeeming a field because you can't redeem it right away. You got to wait till year 3. You got a 2-year waiting period. Lockout period, I think they call it, right? You got a 2-year period where you can't redeem it. So Mocher Bait Bater Choma Yochiach, which if you then go back to Bater Choma, doesn't have that 2-year waiting period, but also cannot be done partially. Chazar Hadin Lo Rizek Rized, the unique thing about each one, about selling a house and selling a field, is not like the other one. Hatzada Shaveh Sheben, this is how we always learn Hatzada Shaveh, Shenigalin, that you can redeem them. But even though you can redeem your house or your field, Ein Loveh V'Goel V'Goel Chatzim, you cannot borrow money to do that. So I would have also said, Afani Avi Makdish. I would have said the same is true about giving a field to Hektish, where you can redeem it, but Nigal, but you cannot borrow money. Ein Loveh V'Goel, you cannot borrow money and redeem it, and you cannot be Goel Chatzim. You cannot redeem half of it. So that's why you need a pasuk. So you would have thought that from the combination of selling a house and selling a field, you learn out that generally when you redeem things, you can't borrow and redeem them. So I would have thought the same thing is true about Hektish. Came along the pasuk to say it's not true about Hektish. V'im Ga'al Yigal. By Hektish, you can be expansive and you can be Goel in many ways. So everyone's happy. We're around 15 lines down. First word on the line. Everyone's happy except for Mar Zutra. Amalei Mar Zutra Breder of Mari the Ravina said, Mar Zutra, I'm not happy. Because I could ask a question on your tzad shaveh, on your ma'atzad, because I could say, what is common to the two things that you cannot borrow and redeem? Remember, what's common about these two things? One is selling a house in a batei choma, and the second is selling a field that's a stei achuzah. The common thing about both of them, I'll remind you, is that when you sell a house, you can only redeem it for year 1 and not beyond. If you sell a field, you can only redeem it starting in year 3 and not beyond. But what's common about them is that you cannot redeem either one during year 2, right? So they're both weaker during year 2. When you give something to Hektish, you can redeem it whenever you want. Year 1, 2, 3, and forever until Yova, right? So ask Rav Zutra Beder of Mari the Ravina, I can ask a question. The common thing that's weak about these two cases is that neither one can be the Gael b'shana shniya. Neither one can be redeemed in the second year. One because you get year 1 never again. One because you get year 3 and forever, but you can never go from year 2. Tomar b'makdish, you can't compare them to Hekdish. Yafekocho, it's a much stronger Geula li Gael b'shana shniya. So that seems to be a question. Amar le Ravina mishum deikal meimar, said Ravina, well, it's true. That's a really good question, but there's a fourth case. You can put it this. There's a fourth case, and the fourth case is Eved Ivri Hanimkar Lo Oved Kochavim Yochiach. A fourth case, and this of course brings us back to where we started, to slavery. The fourth case is if you sell a Jew to an Oved Kochavim. Yesterday, we had a long discussion about what led to this, right? The Jew did Perot Shemitah, they had to sell their possessions, they had to sell their car, they had to sell their house, they had to sell their daughter, they had to borrow biribit, eventually they had to sell themselves to an Oved Kochavim. The pasuk continues in Bahar, and it talks about the responsibility of the family to redeem that person. So there's a responsibility to redeem a Jew who sold himself to a non-Jew, right? But that's a fourth case, and there, says the Gemara now, where are we? Makdish Evan Ivri and Imkar Lovei Kochavim Yochiach Sheyafeh Kocho. You can be very easy to redeem the person. Liga El b'shana shniya. You can buy that person back from a non-Jew in year 1, 2, 5, 20, right? The ein loveh v'goel v'goel lechatzim, but you cannot borrow money to redeem that person. We're going to learn that from a pasuk in a little bit, and therefore I would have taken all of this information and said it should be true about every geula, that if you need to redeem something, you cannot borrow money to redeem that thing. Kamash V'lan comes along the Torah and says it's not true about Hektish. By Hektish, you can borrow money and redeem it, maybe because we want you to redeem it from Hektish, because Hektish really does not want to own the fields, they want the money, right? So we make it a little bit easier for you to redeem it from Hektish specifically. Okay, we're almost halfway, not really, but close to halfway down. Ba minei Rafuna bar Chinina mer Sheshet. Asked Rafuna bar Chinina from Rav Sheshet the following burning question that has been bothering us all day long. Hamocher bayit b'batei arei choma. One of the interesting things about redeeming things is that sometimes, not always, sometimes the Torah says that not only can the person redeem themselves, but their relatives can redeem them. And in fact, the Torah goes through a list of relatives, remember, by a Jew who sold himself to a non-Jew. The Torah says, I'm going to read the pasuk because it's very important, O Dodo, or his uncle, Oh, Ben Dodo or his cousin, Yigalenu. They can redeem him. Oh, Mishar B'Saro Mishpachto, anyone in the family, Yigalenu. Oh, Hesiga Yado Vigalo, or he gets enough money. So we go through a relative that the relatives have to redeem the person, right? Or can, sorry, they can redeem the person. What if you sell your house? A person, let's say I come up on hard times and I sell my house in a walled city. Nigal Krovim or Nigal Krovim. To my relatives, can they redeem it on my behalf? Or is it only if I get enough money to redeem it? So says the Gemara, Gulato, Gulato, Misteach Chuzah Gamar. We compare the word Gulato, written by Batei Choma, to Gulato, written by Steach Chuzah, just like by a field. Masteach Chuzah, Eno Nigal L'Chatzaim. You cannot buy it back in part, but it is Nigalah to the Krovim. But your relatives can, and the Torah very specifically says that. Here too, by Batei Arei Choma, you can't buy back half the house, or let's say you sold 2 houses, you can't buy back 1 room in the apartment, but you can, your relatives can redeem it on your behalf. That was one answer. Oh, Dilma, or maybe, Kiktiva Gu'ula, when it says the word Gulato, which is where we compared Steach Chuzah to Batei Arei Choma, the Gula is referring to partial, right? B'chatzainu dichtiv. It's referring to not redeeming part of the field. Maybe that's where you compare a Steach Chuzah to Batei Arei Choma, right? But b'krovim loktiv. It's not written by krovim. So Amalei Rav Huna said back to him, Rav Sheshet said back to him, Eino nigal. The relatives cannot redeem it. So you are weaker. If you sell your house, the only way you could buy it back is if you come up with the money to buy it back. Which is very devastating, right? You can't borrow money to buy it back. You can't get money from your family. You've got to get a job, earn the money in order to buy it back, according to this opinion, which seems to be the way we paskin, like Rosh Hashanah. 8th, he asked a question from the following Braita. The Braita says, "B'chol geula titnu." That's not what the pasuk says. The pasuk actually says, I'm going to quote the pasuk here, "U'b'chol eretz achusatchem." This is a pasuk in Bahar. In all of the lands that you inherit, geula titnu la'aretz. Excuse me. You can redeem the land. That's a vague pasuk. It doesn't say what it's talking about. It just says very generally, "B'chol eretz achusatchem." In any land that you inherit, you can redeem it. Who's you? Who's what? What's the land? Who's the person? Says the Braita. What does that tell you? B'chol geula titnu. In every case, you can redeem it. That's the rabot batim va'aved ivri. That's to include houses and eved ivri. Because remember, the Torah talks about redemption by a Jew sold to a non-Jew, right? And by a field, right? But this includes houses, and it includes, this is talking about relatives, not you. Right? Your relatives have to redeem you if you're sold to a non-Jew. Your relatives can buy a Steach Chuzah back for you. This includes that your relatives can buy back houses and eved ivri. Now we think that means, my love, it means a house in a walled city, Batei Arei Choma, and that's telling you your relatives can buy back a house in a Batei Arei Choma, which is not what Rav Sheshet just said. No, it's referring to an intermediate case, the case I told you about, which is Batei Chatzerim. It's referring to Batei Chatzerim. What are Batei Chatzerim? Remember, these are houses that have a field with them, right? Which we treat like a Steach Chuzah. This is more about Batei Chatzerim. The Torah says, treat it like a Steach Chuzah. Al Stei Haaretz Yichashev. It's considered to be a field. This is more, well, you're right. But we need a second pasuk to tell you not only that your relatives can buy it back, but that your relatives must buy it back. Hahu lekovo chova laliba Rebbe Eliezer. This is where it gets very tricky if you have relatives who are troublemakers. Because according to Rebbe Eliezer, you have to redeem your relatives. Let's say you have a relative who does some crazy deal and they borrow $10,000 to buy cryptocurrency, and predictably they go broke. According to Rebbe Eliezer, you have to bail them out, right? They might just go do it again. So you got to be very careful about your relatives, right? So, but according to Rebbe Eliezer, you have to bail them out. Titania. Now it says that this is a machloket, by the way, so don't get too worried. The Gaal et Mimkar Achiv. It says you redeem your brother who was sold, rishut. That means you can, right? This is the Tanakama, not Rebbe Eliezer, it's Rebbe Yeshua. You can redeem your brother if you are a nice guy and you happen to like your brother and you have the money, maybe, right? Ata Omer rishut. You're saying, says the Braita, that you can. Maybe you have to redeem him. Talmud Omer, it says, The ish ki lo yiyeh lo goel. If a person doesn't have anyone to redeem them, then they redeem themselves. Now ask the Gemara, the Braita, what does it mean a person has no one to redeem them? Every single person who's Jewish has someone to redeem them, right? Because if you don't have a relative, a brother, you have an uncle. If you don't have an uncle, you have a cousin. If you don't have a cousin, your cousin has a cousin. And since everyone is ultimately related, you got to find someone eventually who can redeem you, right?
You know what? I'm going to respond to that.
Like one, I'll tell you in a second. You'll see the response to your. Hold on. Is there anyone in Yisrael who doesn't have someone to redeem them? Now, of course, Charlie was about to say, "What about a convert?" Right. So Rashi points out here, because to answer Charlie, that this is referring to a stei achuzah. This is referring to a field that you got when Eretz Yisrael was divided among the Shvatim. Converts were not included in the division of stei achuzah. So it's true, a convert might not have a relative if you keep going and going and going. But
that is actually important in the first aliyah of yesterday's Torah reading.
Chitavo el aretz, you said.
Yeah.
Correct. I would point out, since you raised it, Charlie, at this, and I was going to point out anyways, though, that this, when you think about this halacha, it's one more area. The Torah is constantly telling us to be kind and considerate and treat converts well. But one, for many reasons, because they don't have family necessarily. But obviously, this is another reason, right? When you're talking about an agricultural society where land was passed down through inheritance, someone who joins the people after that initial event is not able to get land, right? And so they're essentially landless by definition, which is one more challenge to them as being part of the land ownership of society. They can always buy land, but they can't keep it forever, right? Meaning any land that a convert buys will go back to its owner in Yovel, right? And they have no recourse, essentially. So it's one more area where they are disadvantaged, where the Torah therefore says, provide extra advantages, let's say, or extra consideration for that reason. But this pasuk clearly is talking about relatives, talking about a stei achuzah. So every person who inherited field, who's not, has a relative, right? So Ella zeh sheyesh lo ve'eino rotza likach. It must be he's got family, and they're like, we're not dealing with this bum. He borrowed all this money. We don't want to buy back his field for him. He's just going to do it again. He's going to go back to Vegas, right? Sharashut biyado. You're allowed to do it, but you don't have to. Divrei Rabbi Yoshua. Says Rabbi Eliezer, that's not the case. It says v'ga'alat mimkar achiv chova. You must buy back, if you have the means, the field of your brother. At omer chova in el reshut. Talmud therefore says Rabbi Eliezer, this extra verse comes to tell you b'chol geula titnu. You, in any case, you have to redeem it. Hakatuv kavo chova. Now, just as an aside, of course, this could get very expensive, right? Because all of a sudden, Baron Rothschild found a lot of long-lost cousins, right, who are calling him up. So Rash Tosas, I think, here points out that Rabbi Eliezer would say that this does not apply to all relatives. It applies to your relatives listed in the Torah, meaning your uncle, your cousin, right? But not third degree, second time, 2 times removed or something, right? And so it doesn't apply forever, ad infinitum. It applies to your direct relatives. But the reality is that if you think about it, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you have a huge responsibility to make sure that your relatives are not fiscally irresponsible. Because if they are, you're going to have to bail them out. And that, could be very expensive, right? So it's a very important and interesting practical halacha in those times. Now, continues the Gemara now. We're at the last word on the narrow lines. Amri le Rabbanan, the Ravashi. The Rabbanan said to Ravashi, Amri le Ravina, the Ravashi, some said it was Ravina. Bishlama lemanda amar le Rabot batei choma. I understand that if you're including from this pasuk of Bechol Gula Titnu, right? If you're referring to include Batei Arechom, I know dichtiv Bakol. Therefore, it says all, which is to add more places. If you're just including Batei Chatzerim, might be Kol. Why can't it just say the word Kol? Why need the extra bet? And that's kasha. That's a little bit of a challenge. We don't really have a resolution. Eitvei Abaya. Now, ask Abaya from the following bright. Right now, I'm going to read the pasuk that I read to you earlier because it's going to form the basis of this brayta. You ready? Quotes the pasuk in Bahar. I have a fancy Gemara with it on the side. It says, again, this is referring to a person who sold himself to a non-Jew, right? A human who sold himself or herself, let's say himself, to a non-Jew, including an Oved Avodah Zarah. Pasuk says, O dodo, this is Chafhei Memtet, or his uncle, O ben dodo yigalenu, should redeem him. O misher bisaro yigalenu, or someone else, mishpachto yigalenu, or someone else in his family should redeem him. O hisiga yadom nigal, or he'll get enough money, his stocks will go up eventually, and he can redeem himself. Now, ask the Braita, that word geula was repeated 3 times in the pasuk, right? Why do you have to keep repeating yigalenu, yigalenu, yigalenu? Says the Braita, Matam Lomar yigalenu, yigalenu, yigalenu shalosh pa'amim. Why does it say yigalenu 3 times? The Rabot kol hagulot shnigalot keseder hazeh. It's to tell you that other times where you redeem people, you follow the same rules as redeeming a Jew who's bought by a non-Jew. Now, we think that means that he's redeemed by his relatives, that you cannot redeem half, for example, etc. All those halachot. Now, what are you including? My love, batei arechoma ve'eved ivri. Right? You got 3 words. 1 is necessary, 2 are extra. So what are you adding with these 2 extra words of yigalenu? Presumably to include geula by batei arechoma, where the Torah doesn't say it, and to include geula by a eved ivri, meaning a Jew who's sold to a Jew, right? That those people can be redeemed by their relatives, right? Remember, we started off this whole discussion by asking, can a Jew sold to another Jew be bought off by their relatives? This pasuk seems to imply that they can. Says the Gemara, nope, that's not what it means. Look, it's referring to batei chatzerim u'stei achuzah. It's referring to the fact that relatives can buy back a house that you sold in a field or a field. So remember, that's obvious. We already quoted those from the psukim. Batei chatzerim u'stei achuzah behediktiv. It says in the Torah, astei haaretz yichashev. This is where you're right. It does say you can redeem it, but it doesn't tell you how to redeem it. And this is Kedamar of Nachum Bar Yitzchak, the Rabot Karov Kodem. As Rav Nachum Bar Yitzchak said elsewhere, we found out in 3 seconds where that elsewhere is, but here too, Achanami, the Rabot Karov Kodim, that your relatives go in order of closeness to you, meaning that you first go to your uncle, right, who's your closest relative, then your cousin, then your 5th uncle, etc. So you go in order of birth connection, which is a blood connection, right? So your uncle is closer to you because it's your father's blood. Your uncle's son is next, your uncle's grandson, your whatever, and you go through all the relatives. Heicha in Rav Nachum Bar Yitzchak. Now, where did Rav Nachum Bar Yitzchak say that? On the following question. I jumped the gun. I told you we had the question, but we're about to have it right now. Eved Ivri hanimkar li Yisrael nigala krovim or nigala krovim. Okay, remember, a Jew is sold to a non-Jew. The Torah explicitly says relatives got to redeem that person. But what if a Jew is sold to another Jew? Is it nigal likrovim or inu nigal likrovim? Do the relatives redeem them or not? Now, liba de Rabbi letiboilecha. It's not a question according to Rabbi, because Rabbi holds that there's no geula at all. Damer, we had this a week ago. Mishena nigal be'ela nigal b'sheish amalo mifrek. According to Rabbi, the only person who can be redeemed is a Jew sold to a non-Jew. A Jew sold to a Jew can only go out in 6 years in Shemitah, or 6 years, let's just say 6 years, not Shemitah, but can't go out by being redeemed. So there's no question. You can't redeem himself. His uncle can't redeem him either. The question is according to the Rabbanan, who say you can redeem the person himself, but can his relatives do it too? Right? Do you derive sachir to compare selling yourself to a non-Jew to selling yourself to a Jew? Veloy darshi yigalenu. Odilma yigalenu lezev v'lo Yigalenu means you can be redeemed by this non-Jew if you're sold to a non-Jew, but not in another case. So Tashma, let's try to prove it from the following Braita. The Braita says, B'chol geula titnu. Always redeem people. What does that include? The Rabot, Batim, the Eved Ivri. Remember, we focused before on the Batim. But who's the Eved Ivri? My love, it's Batei Arechoma and Eved Ivri and Imkar Yisrael. The Eved sounds like a Jew sold to another Jew. No, not necessarily. It could be Eved Ivri and Imkar Ovei Kochavim. A Jew is sold to a non-Jew. Says Gemara, that's ridiculous. Again, it says specifically in the Torah, Ododo ben dodo yigalenu. Turn the page. This is where, well, like we just said a few minutes ago, the reason the Torah repeats that you redeem a Jew who sold to a non-Jew is the kovo chova, that not only can you redeem him, but you must redeem him. And Afilu the Rebbe Yoshua, who says that you don't have to do it by a Jew sold to a non-Jew, you have to do it if you can. Why do you have to do it? As Rashi points out, because we really don't want Jews to be living among non-Jews against their will. They're very likely to not observe and continue practicing as Jews. So therefore, there's a communal responsibility. Well, it's not a communal. There's a familial responsibility to redeem that person. Okay. You may argue that there's a communal responsibility because ultimately everyone is related. Okay. Amar Tashma, top line. Why does it say Yigalenu Shlosha Pamim? We just asked this question before. Why does it say redeem him 3 times? The Rabot Kol Agulot Shnegolot Keseder Hazeh. It's to include all other redemptions that happen the same way, meaning they can be done by relatives. Now, what's that to include? My love, but they are Echoma, where it doesn't say redemption, and Eved Ivrianim Krali Yisrael. So that implies that you can redeem them by their relatives. No, that's not what it's referring to. It's referring to Batei Chatzirim B'Stei Achuzah. This is a quote from a few lines ago, asking why would you need to include Batei Chatzirim Behed Yektiv Be? I'll stay Haaretz Yichashev. Rav Nachman Yitzchak the Karov Kodem. This is where Rav Nachman Yitzchak said, it's to tell you that you go by order of relatives, so that the closer relation has a first responsibility, just like, as of course, the story of Ruth is famous to all of us, right? Which is another case of Geula. Yibum is a very similar case of Geula. And remember, what's his name? Boaz said, I cannot redeem you because there's somebody closer, right? So just like by a sadeh, you go after closer relatives by other things, by redeeming a slave, you also go after closer relatives. Okay, we're up to the 2 dots on Chaf Aleph on the bet. The Mishnah continued and said, you should pay attention for this, it's going to get very sticky here in a second. It said that a slave can be owned by its owner by nirtza, right? If after 6 years, the Eved Ivri says to his owner, Ahavti et Adoni, et Ishti, et Banai, I love my owner, you're such a great master, I love my wife and children who I have in this relationship, I want to stick around. So what does he do then? He knocks a hole in his ear at the doorpost, and Avadola Olam, he's a slave forever, which means till Yova, right? That's what Olam means. How does he make that kinyan? Like banging through the ear. That's the kinyan. The act of banging is how you acquire the slave. Once you had a hole bang through your ear, the only way to get yourself back is through Yovel, right? 50 forever. And if the owner dies, how do you know if the owner dies, you get yourself back? Because it says v'avado. It doesn't say v'eved. It says you are his servant. Lo etaben lo tabat, not his children. Le'olam, meaning forever. Forever does not mean forever. Forever means le'olam moshel yovel, for a full yovel cycle. Right? That's what le'olam always means. Tanu Rabbanan. Now, what do you use to bang through this guy's ear? I don't have English in front of me, but if someone does, they're more than welcome to help me translate these things. But we usually translate the word martzea as an awl, right? I don't know what that is, to be honest with you, but it's a good word for Scrabble, right? AWL. And so you use whatever, I don't know, it's some implement that you use to bang holes in people's ears. I don't know exactly what it is, like a hammer, right? So martzea, ainli ela martzea. I only know, says the Braita, that you can use this martzea. Minayin the Rabot, other implements that would make holes in people's ears. For example, a sul and a sirah. I don't know what a sul is, but a sirah, Rashi says, is a thorn, right? Like a sharp piece of wood. And a machat, which is a needle, which we all know what that is. V'amikdeach, v'amichatech, which are things that you use. Rashi uses words that are not English, but Rashi uses words that are, these are things that you use to scrape off, like in leather or to carve things. I'm sure Rachel's got all these implements to scratch things away. How do you can use those things as well? Tamalomar, it says vilakachta, which is marbeh. You take anything, basically. The Rabot kol davar shnikach biyad. Anything you can hold in your hands. I guess not a machine. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi says, no. It has to be very similar to a martzea. Ma martzea miyuchad shel matechet. Just like a martzea is made out of metal, it has to be an implement that's made out of metal. Afkol shel matechet, but not a needle, for example, and not a, I don't know, other things that are made out of leather or something. Now, davar acher, ham martzea, right? It says you take the martzea. This is in the Parshat Re'eh where it repeats it. That is lahavi ham martzea gadol. I don't know what this means. It could even be the big martzea, the massive one. It doesn't have to be a small one. Amar Rabbi Elazar, we're going to discuss this all in a second, don't worry. Said Rabbi Elazar, Yudan Beribi Hayadoresh. Yudan Beribi was a person, his name was Yudan, and he was very special. So very special people were called Beribi, meaning sir, right? The teacher. So Yudan Beribi used to Doresh. Kishahem Rotzin, En Rotzin El B'milta. When you bang a hole in the slave's ear, you have to do it in the earlobe. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with this, but there's a soft part to your ear and there's a hard part to your ear. And so when you make the hole in the slave, you do the soft part where most people get earrings, at least the first one, but not the hard part. What's it called, the hard part? Cartilage? The cartilage, okay. So it has to be in the, what do you call the soft part? The lobe, okay. And not the cartridge, the cartilage. Chachamim say, Ein Eved Kohen, Eved Ivri Kohen Nirtzah. You can never make a hole in the ear of an Eved Ivri who's a Kohen. Why? Nipnei Shenaseh Balmum. Because that would make him into a wounded person. That's considered to be a mum. And we're going to see in a second, why do you care if you make him into Balmum? He's chose to be an Eved, right? We're going to see in a second that you're not allowed to. Now, it says the Gemara, but if you're going to knock a hole into the milta, imtam or milta imrotzim, if they only make a hole in the lobe, heich Eved Ivri Kohen Naseh Balmum. Right? Why would it turn him into a balmum? It doesn't make you an injured person to have a hole in your earlobe. It's only an injury if you make a hole through your cartilage. So clearly, according to the Chachamim, you make a hole in the cartilage of the ear, right? According to the Chachamim, you do ritziyah in the cartilage of the ear. Now, let's understand, let's unpack, as the kids say, this whole braita. Right? What are the first argument? There's an argument about whether you have to use something, anything that can make a hole in your ear, including a needle, or according to Rebbe, it has to be made out of metal. What's the difference? This goes back to the age-old debate as to how you fundamentally view the Torah. When the Torah says a principle and then it limits it, it says do it with anything. It doesn't do with anything. Do it very generally. And it says with a needle, let's say, or with an ozen in this case, right? Does that mean klal uprat? That meaning do it with anything. What does anything mean? Things that are similar to an ozen, or is it riboy umiyat, where it says do it with anything in the world? And ozen is there to tell you it has to be like an ozen, meaning we're excluding something that's not an ozen, but not as expansive. More expansive than a klal uprat. So how do you view the world? Let's read that inside. We've done this many, many times before, I think, that the machloket here, Micah, Mifli, Rebbe Darish Klali Prati. Rebbe looks at the world, meaning looking at the Torah, as talking about principles. And so the prat is meant to inform what you do. And according to, and let's read it inside. You take something to knock a hole in the Eved's ear, that's a klal, implying you could do anything. But Martzea tells you it has to be a prat, meaning it's a limitation. It has to be similar to the ozen, right? And then it says be'azno, which is a general term, go into his ear, implying you could do anything in the ear. Ubedelet, chazaru kalal. So it's a klal, pradu klal, and the rule is yatadan elokeina prat. A klal, pradu klal means that you include everything that's similar to the prat. Ma prat mufurash shel matechet. Just like an ozen is definitely made out of metal, afkol shel matechet. Anything you use has to be made out of metal. Rabbi Yossi is darish in a more expansive way, that the Torah is telling you ribuye umiute. It's telling you everything and excluding some things, right? And therefore you darish in the pasuk the following way. Am I? Thank you. Lakachta is riba. Take anything. Martzeya is a miut. You can only take things that are like a martzeya. And then it says bazno bedelat chazav riba. So you have what's called a riba mia to riba. Everything limits and then everything. Riba hakol. You include everything. My Rabbi called Mili. My mi'et sam. You only exclude one thing that's not similar to a martzeya. And what is that? I said ozen before, I meant martzeya. You exclude sam. What is sam? Where you take acid, right? If you took acid and put it on the slave's ear, it would make a hole through his ear. That would be very painful in my understanding, right? But that would not be okay because you have to use a device. So at the very least, you have to include an object, an implement to do it. So you can exclude something that's not an implement, but according to Rabbi Yossi, you include everything else. Amar, first wide line, says the Braita. Hamartzeh lahavi martzeh gadol my mashma. How do you know that hamartzeh means a big one? K'damar Rava, hayerech, haymiyumanit shabiyerech. When it says, it's a fascinating halacha of Rava, and if everyone remembers it from Chulin, right? The Torah says you're not allowed to eat the gid hanasheh. Says Rava in the Gemara, it's not Rava, it's a Tana really. It only applies to the right gid hanasheh of an animal, not the left gid hanasheh. Why? Because it says hayarech. And the hey tells you the more powerful one. And since animals are, of course, righties, right? Because that's how they assumed, right? So therefore, it only refers to the right leg of the animal. So the same thing is true about Martzea. It says Ha-Martzea, it means the powerful Martzea. It has to be the big one of the Martzaim. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Yudim B'Rabbi HaYodorish, Amar Rabbi Lazar, sorry, Yudam B'Rabbi HaYodorish, Kishem Rotzin and Rotzin B'Milta. You would make a hole in the earlobe, not in the cartilage. And the Chachamim said, no, we disagree. Ain't Eved Ivri Kohen Nertzah. You can never do Ritzia on an Eved Ivri who's a Kohen. Because it would turn him into a Balmum. Says Gemara, who cares? Yaseh Balmum. So make him into a Balmum. What he wants to be a slave. He wants to, if Eved wants to break his leg, let him break his leg, right? Amar Rabba Barav Shila. No, because the pasuk says, Amar Kra, the Shav El Mishpachto. When you're done with that slave, send him back to his family, meaning to be as part of his family, including if he's a Kohen, that he could still be a Kohen. The Muchzak Shemishvachto doesn't just mean send them home in one piece. I mean, send them home physically, but also in his spiritual, well, spiritual is a strong word, in his kuhuna in one piece, and therefore you cannot make a hole in his ear. Now, Ibayl, they asked the following question. Okay, this is a continuation, and you're going to see how this goes back to our own Gemara's full circle. And remember that a Jew is generally not supposed to sleep with a non-Jew. Okay, it's not really a prohibition, a little complicated, but you're not really supposed to. Let's leave it at that. A Kohen is not allowed to sleep with a woman who's non-Jewish because she's considered to be in the category of Zonah, and it says Isha Kohen Zonah v'chalalalo yikachu, so he cannot sleep with her, right? Now, we know that a Jewish slave is allowed to sleep with a shifcha, right? Because he's a slave. Now, we had a machloket, remember last week, about whether it's only a Jewish slave who's forced into slavery, not voluntary slavery, but certainly a Jew who's forced into slavery is allowed to be over the regular prohibition of sleeping with a slave, right? What about a Kohen who's forced into slavery? Can he do it or not do it? So ask the Gemara Boiler. Eved Ivri Kohen, a Jew who's forced into slavery, who's a Kohen. Can his owner force him to sleep and marry, or sleep with, I would say, not marry, a Shivcha Kinanit? Do you say, Kiddushin, Torah came up with this great innovation that a Jewish slave can sleep with a non-Jew. So Loshna Kohanim, why Loshna Yisrael? No one really can do that. So they said you're allowed to do it. Why should it matter for Kohen or Yisrael? Odilma, well, Shani Kohanim. Maybe Kohanim are different. Kohanim have a lot of extra prohibitions. Maybe they can't sleep with the Shivcha Kinanit. So Loshna Yisrael, period. So Rav said mutar. Rav said that a Kohen who's a slave can sleep with a Shivcha Kinanit. And Shmuel said asur, he can't. Okay? Now, this was reported over to other people. And Rav Nachman heard about this. And Rav Nachman thought that this was outrageously silly. How in the world could Shmuel say that you can't sleep with that Kohen cannot sleep with Shivcha Kinanit? And now Rav Nachman got angry at Rav Anan, because Rav Anan was a student of Shmuel. And so Amar le Rav Nachman, Rav Anan, what the heck were you doing during those 10 years that you spent learning with Shmuel? You playing cards? That's what he says to him. Meaning, how could you have not said to Shmuel, what your position is ridiculous? It's so obvious to anyone who just learned the Gemara that we learned. So said Rav Nachman to Rav Anan, Ke'avita be'emar of Shmuel, when you were learning in the house of Shmuel, be'iskanduri italitu, were you playing cards all day? Not so clear what iskanduri was, but it's some activity that's not learning Torah. I think Rashi says something about drawing on papers. Rashi says you were misachkim b'paspasin. You were playing ball, maybe, I don't know, chips of wood. Now this says. So that's what I said, playing dice, right? Playing cards. You were doing some activity that wasn't learning. Because why didn't you say to Shmuel the obvious argument against Shmuel? My time in Timurle, meha. Quote Shmuel, the bright that we just said, which is the Chachamim say, Ein Eved Knani nirtza. You can never put a hole in the ear of an Eved Knani. Why? Because you're not allowed to make a mum in an Eved Knani. Not Eved Ivri, Kohen nirtza. An Eved Ivri Kohen, because you can't make a mum in his ear, right? If it was true what Shmuel said, that he's not allowed to marry a shivcha Kanaanit, in Rabba Maselo shivcha Kanaanit, then of course you can't ever redeem him. You can't ever, not redeem him. You can't ever make a hole in his ear. Because what does the Torah say? The Eved says, Ahavti et Adoni et ishti et banai. If you can't get a wife, then of course you don't have an ishti. And so it must be that that the fact that no one said an Eved Kohen cannot get Nirtzah because he doesn't have a wife, that Shmuel is wrong. And an Eved Kohen can have a wife. So typically, too low midi, and stop talking about it. This is a clear proof. If you stop playing cards all day, you would clearly understand that Shmuel is wrong and that there's no way that you can prohibit an Eved Ivri Kohen from marrying an Eved Shivcha Kananit. You want to do a few more lines? You want to stop here? Charlie wants to do a few more lines. I'm going to make this easier for Dove. I think Dove is doing tomorrow. So I will do a few more lines for Dove, but it's also, hope that everyone agrees with that. It's also a very reminiscent of last week's parsha, 2 weeks ago parsha. Because the next question is, what about a Yifat Toar? So this gets us a little segue into Yifat Toar, which we knew we were coming here eventually. Right? Yifat Toar, of course, is a non-Jewish woman. As we're about to see, she can be a married non-Jewish woman. Go to war, the Torah said, right, 2 weeks ago, you take a lot of captives, because that was the nature of war. And in your captives, you have 10 women or people there. One of the people sees a very beautiful woman and wants to marry her. There's a couple of problems with that. First of all, she might be married, but more importantly, she's not Jewish, right? So what do? So the Torah says a crazy halacha. That first of all, I'm going to say this is crazy, even though it's not what we say today. You can force her to convert, which is a pretty strange concept because usually we don't talk about forced conversion, right? You can force her to convert to Judaism against her will, potentially, and make her Jewish and then marry her, sleep with her, right? But before that, before you even force her to convert, you can sleep with her when she's not Jewish, which is, of course, against all the rules that we generally have. What about a Kohen? Can a Kohen also have a Yifat Toar? Okay, so Ibaylu, Kohen Mao Yifat Toar. Do you say, well, look, Kiddushin, the Torah made this innovation that a person can sleep with the Yifat Toar, so Loshna Kohen, Loshna Yisrael, right? It's way off the books already. You know, let's allow anybody. Or do you say the Kohanim have all kinds of extra rules? So it's one thing to make this crazy rule by a Yisrael, but not by a Kohen. Rav says mutar, just like Rav said by an Eved, it's permitted. And Shmuel Amar asur. Now says the Gemara, first of all, let's be very clear. The first time, everybody agrees that he's allowed, even a Kohen can sleep with her, even Shmuel. Why? Because what's the whole reason for Yifat Toar? It's because we're afraid that you encounter this woman, you fall in love with her, you're infatuated with her, you're going to sleep with her anyway. So the Torah wants to make it permitted for you, right? The low dibra Torah keneged yitzer hara. The Torah only did this to permit you because we knew you were going to do it anyways. And so a Kohen's going to have the same yitzer hara. So it makes sense to permit it for a Kohen also. The argument is about the future. Can you keep her as a wife, right? And sleep with her a second, meaning a second, a third, a 10th time, right? Rav Amar Mutar Shmuel Amar Asur. Rav Amar Mutar Hov Ishtri Ishtri. Look, once we said you can. You can't change the rules in the middle of the game. Shmuel Amar Asur, the Havile Giyoret, because in fact she becomes a convert against her will. She's treated like a convert. And remember, Giyoret, the Kohen, the Kohen can't marry a Giyoret. And so therefore, although she's in a Yifat Toar, she can sleep with her one time, but no further times. Now, some people say that that's not the argument. That staying married to her after the first time, that a Kohen cannot stay with her because she's a Gioret. Having the Gioret, and he's not allowed to marry a Gioret. Now look at Rav and Shmuel about the first time. Rav Amar Mutar Dalo Dibra Torah Yetzer Hara. The Torah permitted you to do this because of your Yetzer Hara, and the Yetzer Hara afflicts Kohanim and Yisraelim equally. And Shmuel Amar Asur, where you could do the second part of the pasuk. You can bring her into your house, then you can sleep with her. Therefore, the whole principle of Yifat Toar does not apply to a Kohen going out to war. Tomorrow, I believe Dove is picking this up tomorrow. It will be further halachot about Yifat Toar. So stay tuned for those many details.
All right.
Have a great week, everyone.
Thanks. Tomorrow
You're doing tomorrow, right?
we usually start on Sundays at 7:30.
I usually start at 7:45.
7:45. Okay, 7:45 is good. So,
I'll put it in the chat just because I think it's different in the bulletin.
okay.
Okay, have a good week, everyone.
Thank you.